Good morning. I'm back for chapter 21 of the report card. This chapter is called Rebellion. The principal's office looked way too familiar to me. The one big difference was that today there were so many people in the room that they couldn't all fit at the round table. One lady was sitting at Miss Hackney's desk. I knew who she was because I'd seen her on cable TV. It was Miss Tursum, the school superintendent. Mrs. Burns sat on a folding chair next to the principal's desk. Miss Drummond, the guidance counselor, was there too, and beside her was Miss Anderson, the school secretary. She had a notepad on her lap, ready to keep track of who said what. Miss Hackney sat at her usual spot at the table. Dr. Trindler sat on her left, and then there was Miss Noyes and Miss Zhang. My mom's eyebrows went up when she saw Stephen and his mom and dad sitting at the table. I wasn't surprised at all. I'd have been amazed not to see them. But then came Merton Lake and both his parents, and I had no clue why they were at the meeting. Stephen caught my eye as I took a chair at the table, and I saw the slightest flicker of a smile. I looked away. There are times when nothing is more dangerous than a smile. This was one of those times. About 10 seconds after Mom and I sat down, my dad came rushing in, nodded a few quick hellos around the table, and took the seat next to me. Then Miss Hackney said, it's been quite a morning here at Philbrook Elementary School. Mrs. Noyes, please begin by telling us what happened during your third period social studies class. Miss Noyes nodded at Miss Hackney and said, well, I had prepared a 12-question quiz from the weekend reading assignment in the social studies book. We talked about the chapter, and then I passed out the quiz. It was just one page. When everyone was finished, I had the students exchange papers, take out their red pencils, and we began discussing the answers. There was a lot of laughing as we corrected the quiz, so I began walking around the room, and I saw that almost every student had written a nonsense answer to every question. Miss Hackney said, a nonsense answer? Yes, said Miss Noyes. For example, on the question, who was the President of the United States at the start of the Great Depression? Students wrote answers like Donald Duck or Elvis Presley or my Uncle Lenny. Very silly and wrong. Miss Hackney said, and what grade did most of your students get on this quiz? Miss Noyes glanced at me before she answered, 0. All but 2 of them got a 0. And then during fourth period, when the other half of the blue team had social studies, I warned the class before the quiz that there was to be no funny business. But when the quizzes were graded, it was the same thing, all 0s, except for 2 of the students who didn't participate in the silliness. I'd have bet anything that one of those 2 kids was Merton Lake, but it wasn't important at the moment. Miss Hackney said, who wants to start explaining this? Stephen and I both said, I do, at the same moment, but I was the one who kept on talking. It's all my fault, Miss Hackney. I got this idea that if I got some 0s on tests, and then if we talked some of the other kids into getting some 0s, we could get people to notice how everybody is so crazy about grades and test scores all the time, and how that's kind of a problem. So this whole thing was my fault. Stephen shook his head and said, that was my idea, the part about getting 0s. And then we worked on the plan some more together, but that part was my idea, remember? At that moment, I wish Stephen could have been just a little less honest, because then he would have seen that I wasn't trying to steal the credit for his idea. I was trying to keep us both from getting run out of town by an angry mob of teachers and parents. But Stephen wasn't clever that way, and there wasn't a sneaky bone in his body, which is one of the things I've always liked best about him. So I said, okay, yes, that part was your idea, but I was the one who was putting the idea into action. I was the one who started things off by getting some 0s last Friday, and then we didn't talk this weekend, and I guess you must have called a bunch of kids, right? And that's why everyone else got 0s today, but it's still really my fault, and I'm sorry, and now it's all over. Miss Hackney said, I wish it were that simple, Nora, but it's not. First, there's the matter of this handbill that Stephen was trying to pass out in the halls today. She passed sheets of paper to her left and right. I stared at my copy as Miss Hackney read the words aloud. Calling all kids. Tired of stupid tests? Tired of fighting for grades? Do you hate those mastery tests? Then join the rebellion. Enlist today. How? Simple. Get a 0 on your next test. Let's show everybody that we can think for ourselves. Questions? Ask Stephen Curtis. Miss Hackney looked at Stephen and then around the room. Rebellion, she said, is not something we need or want at Philbrook Elementary School. I was stunned. I couldn't believe Stephen had done something so bold, and he'd put his name on the thing. And then he'd gotten all but 2 of the kids on our team to actually do it too. Stephen must have talked on the phone the whole weekend. Miss Hackney continued. And then there's the matter of Stephen and Merton's fight. Mr. Lake raised his hand and said, I don't accept that. It was not a fight. He pointed at Stephen. That child attacked my son, and Merton was forced to defend himself. And don't forget that Merton is one of the 2 students who did not go along with this conspiracy. I never seen Merton's dad before, but I was guessing he was a lawyer. Miss Curtis glared at him and said, Stephen has never attacked anyone in his life. Miss Hackney said, please, let's stay focused here. There was a shoving match in front of the school this morning, and it looked like trouble to the teacher who was out there on bus duty, and Miss Byrne had to pull both boys apart to stop it. Isn't that right? Miss Byrne nodded. Yes, it wasn't exactly a fight, but it was certainly headed that way. It was a definite skirmish. I almost smiled at that. Leave it to Miss Byrne to find the perfect word, skirmish. Miss Hackney said, very well. I'd like to summarize our situation. We have 2 students who have admitted that they organized and encouraged rebellious behavior. And we have 2 boys who were nearly fighting. But our most serious problem is that half of the 5th grade class decided to treat 2 quizzes as if they didn't matter at all. They treated their schoolwork like it was a big joke. Miss Hackney glanced around the table, and then she looked right at me and said, a disobedient attitude has been set loose in our school, and we have got to stop it now. The lady sitting at Miss Hackney's desk stood up. Everybody turned to look at her, and she said, I'm Julia Tursum, Superintendent of Schools. When I spoke with Miss Hackney an hour ago, I advised her to isolate the blue team students from the other children in the school. That's why they've all been in the library for the past 45 minutes. The nurse and the custodian are acting as emergency substitutes so that their regular teachers could be here this morning. Miss Tursum paused. There's a special way that presidents and mayors stand and tilt their heads and hold their hands when they give important speeches. That's how Miss Tursum looked. She swung her eyes slowly across her audience and said, about a year ago, we had a problem with vandalism at the junior high school. Lockers were damaged, mirrors in the washrooms were broken, walls were written on, and books were destroyed. And I'm sorry to report that it took more than 8 months to get that vandalism completely stopped. Why did it take so long? It's very simple. Because the principal of that school did not jump on the problem soon enough or hard enough. Our situation today is not quite as serious as vandalism, but it's not so different from it either. If the children who got 0s on those quizzes go to lunch 45 minutes from now and start laughing and bragging about what they've done, this defiant attitude could easily spread to the rest of the school, and that must not happen. That is why we have to handle this problem forcefully and immediately. Every student in the Philbrook schools must understand that tests and grades are serious business. Every student in our schools must always try to do his or her best to earn excellent scores. That's what education in Philbrook is all about, excellence. And right now, those students in the library are confused about that. So we've got to solve this problem in the next 30 minutes. Miss Hackney? Miss Hackney smiled briefly and nodded. Thank you, Miss Tursum. And what we're going to do is have a meeting with the whole blue team right now, just across the hall in the media center. We are going to stay focused on the facts, and we are going to point out the mistakes that have been made. We are going to make it clear that this kind of behavior cannot and will not be tolerated ever again. And to emphasize the seriousness of this matter, Mrs. Tursum and I have decided that Nora Rowley and Stephen Curtis are suspended from school for 2 weeks, effective immediately. My first thought was for my mom and dad. Mom gasped and sat there like a statue, her back straight and stiff, and I could see the beginning of a tear at the corner of her eye. Dad's face showed pure disbelief. I felt terrible for them. And then I saw Stephen sitting there trying to get his mind around what that meant. Suspended from school for 2 weeks. His face was pale, and both his mom and dad were looking right at me. There was no doubt in anybody's mind I was the cause of this whole mess, and that's how I felt too. I imagined what would happen at the big team meeting. There'd be a long lecture with Miss Hackney shaking her finger a lot, and Miss Tursum would be frowning at our friends and threatening to kick everyone else out of school, just like they were suspending Stephen and me. And of course, Merton Lake would be sitting there the whole time with a smug little smile on his face. Awful. And there was nothing I could do about it. Fact, once a plan starts to collapse, it comes crashing down fast. All you can do is try to jump out of the way, and sometimes you can't. Miss Hackney was about to say something else when Miss Byrne raised her hand. The principal said, "Yes, Miss Byrne." Miss Byrne stood up and smoothed the front of her skirt. "Miss Hackney, I need to say something. I do not agree with this punishment." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was strong. I think that the motives of Nora and Stephen should be taken into account here. The things they did may have been naive, and they certainly may have caused some problems for Ms. Noyes and Ms. Yang and our fellow teachers. But these two weren't simply trying to stir up trouble, and what they've been doing has absolutely nothing in common with vandalism, Ms. Tursum. Vandalism is mindless and destructive, and what Nora and Stephen have been doing is anything but that. Miss Hackney stood up and leaned forward with both hands on the table. "That's quite enough, Miss Byrne. This is neither the time nor the place for personal opinions." But Miss Tursum held up a hand. "It's all right, Miss Hackney. We have nothing to hide here. Our school district has always been a place for free and open discussion, so please continue, Miss Byrne." Miss Byrne nodded at the superintendent and said, "Thank you. Well, as I was saying, these are good kids, and their motives were good. These students are simply trying to get everyone to look more closely at some of the negative side effects of testing and grading. The teachers at this school and at every school in our town have raised the same kind of concerns, and teachers all across Connecticut have pointed out that this focus on test scores is unhealthy, especially the CMT scores. Nora has experienced those issues firsthand, and she's intelligent enough to have noticed the problems. And she and Stephen have been brave enough to try to do something about it, braver than some of the rest of us have been. So I want to go on record here. I am flatly opposed to these suspensions, and I think that many of the other teachers in our schools, and perhaps a good number of people in the town of Philbrook, would agree with me." When Miss Byrne finished, Einstein would have loved it. It was like that timeless moment before the Big Bang. Then the universe began to explode. There was a short burst of applause as Miss Yang and Miss Noyes got up from the table and walked over to stand beside Miss Byrne. They were fellow teachers like Miss Byrne had mentioned, and teachers stick together. My mom stopped holding her breath. My dad nodded at Miss Byrne and said, "That's right. Maybe Nora's onto something here," which got him a gentle shush from my mom. Miss Curtis patted Stephen's arm, and Stephen began to get some color back in his face. Then my mom and Miss Curtis started talking back and forth above my head. Stephen's dad took out a handkerchief and blew his nose and then wiped his forehead, which was the wrong order if you think about it. Merton's mom had one eyebrow lifted, and she whispered something in her husband's ear. Merton sat there with a twerpy grin on his mug, and he tried to catch my eye, but I ignored him. Miss Hackney tried to keep her face muscles under control, and in the middle of all the noise and chatter, she kept saying, "Let's stay focused, people." The superintendent looked around and kept her lips pulled back into a tight smile, but her eyes told the real story. I could see her imagining what might happen if this issue broke loose and started bouncing all over town. The school secretary had given up trying to take notes, and when she started talking with Miss Drummond, words and phrases floated across the table. "Really? Oh, yes, because on Monday it was only..." Well, and when she told me that, "No, you're kidding. Yes, I heard that too." Dr. Trindler just smiled and tapped his fingertips together. The psychologist was enjoying himself. And me? I was trying to see everything at once. Then I looked at Miss Byrne. She was in her chair again, her hands folded on her lap. We exchanged a look, only for a second. A lot was said during that glance. It was not a kid-to-teacher moment. It was person to person. Finally, Miss Hackney pushed her voice up an octave and said, "Come to order, please. Everyone, please, quiet down." And when the room was quiet, she said, "Thank you. Now, I have an idea or two, but perhaps our superintendent should give us her thoughts first." Miss Turson kept her smile locked in place, but I could tell she had no clue what to do. Again, her eyes gave her away. I could see her problem. Everyone could. If she took too strong a stand, she might have a real rebellion on her hands. And if she took too weak a stand, then she would lose some of her authority. Miss Turson said, "Well, I really think that all things considered, we shouldn't try to handle this at the district level. This is a local school issue, and since you're the principal, Miss Hackney, I think we should hear your ideas first." It was another Einstein moment. Time and space suspended, all eyes on Miss Hackney's face. Everyone could see what was happening. Two powerful, intelligent women were each scared to take the next step, and I felt bad for both of them. After all, I was the one who had gotten everyone into this mess in the first place. I wished I could help them. Then something began happening, something new. I've always been the light bulb girl. Thoughts would come blasting out of nowhere like a lightning bolt on a sunny afternoon. Boom! And I'd have a new idea. This was different. An idea was definitely coming, but softly. It was like I was looking at a broad green lawn, and then there was this passing cloud or a shift in the wind, and every blade of grass snapped to attention, sharp and crisp. And there, across the lawn, I could see the footsteps of an idea, a simple path, and I could see it had always been there, and the path was for me. All I had to do was the next good thing. I raised my hand. Miss Hackney had never been happier to call on someone. "Yes, Nora." I don't know why I stood up before I started talking, but I did. I said, "If it's all right with you, Miss Hackney, I'd like to talk to the whole blue team. I think I need to say something to everyone. And then whatever you and Miss Turson decide to do about punishments and everything, that'll be okay with me." And instantly, Stephen stood up and said, "Me too." There we were again, equal partners. Miss Hackney looked from Stephen to me and then turned to look at Miss Turson. Miss Turson turned to look at me, and then she looked back at Miss Hackney. And then Miss Hackney looked at me again and said, "That sounds like a reasonable request. I think we should all walk across the hall to the library right now." It must have felt like a reasonable request to everyone because the whole room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. As people started getting up and moving toward the door of the office, my dad leaned my way and whispered, "I sure hope you know what you're doing." I whispered back, "Me too."